Welcome to the video on appositives. I will be your host, Mrs. Fulmer. I've given you a packet on appositives. It's got some practice problems and also some information, but I'm hoping that this video will help clear up some common misunderstandings. So you've all seen appositives in the past. You've seen sentences like this even if your teachers haven't called them appositives. Mrs. Fulmer, comma, my English teacher, comma, trips even when she stands still. But that sentence is kind of boring. It doesn't really add any new information to the sentence. So we're going to learn how to use appositives in ways that vary our sentence structure and help us to communicate more ideas. So what are appositives? Appositives give us more information about the noun, but I actually like to think about them as replacement nouns. So, for example, John, comma, my brother, comma, is an architect. Now, if we think about my brother as a replacement noun, we could just say, my brother's an architect. Leave the name completely out of it. My brother and John would work equally well as the subject of this sentence, but we include both to provide that extra information. Appositives are nouns. They will often start, for that reason, with a or the, because those are articles that begin nouns. They cannot start with to, or of, or with, or before, or any of those words, because those are not noun words. Those are prepositions and a subordinate conjunction. So when we think about punctuating appositives, we've got kind of two types, but one is the type we're really going to work with. So we have essential appositives, and they're usually quite short. Things like, my teacher, Mrs. Fulmer, asked me to stay. That sentence would be too vague unless I included the name. So I do include the name with my teacher. Most of the appositives that we're going to work with in the next year are non-essential appositives. I call them the real kind, because those are the ones that make your sentence interesting. They must always go in a comma prison if they're non-essential. Basically what we're saying when we put things in a comma prison is that it can be dropped from our sentence. We don't need it. So I call it a comma prison just as an easy way of reminding you that you have to have a comma on either side because it's non-essential. My English teacher, comma, the one with the videos, other comma, likes to rant. You can't just have one comma unless you have a period, which is kind of serving as the other wall of your prison. We'll talk about that more, but just for reference sake, it must go into a comma prison. To make matters more complicated, appositives can be quite long, and they can contain their own commas. So you've got sentences like this: a balding, comma, smooth-faced man, comma, he could have been anywhere between 40 and 60. So you can see that that's a little bit more complicated appositive, but the one thing that we want to ask ourselves is, what is it replacing? What is the noun that we're replacing here? And the noun is he. He is a balding, smooth-faced man. We could equally well say a balding, smooth-faced man could have been anywhere. What I like to put it in a positive form rather than simply cutting out the noun, because when you put it in a positive form, you're adding this extra information that's non-essential to your sentence, and sometimes you don't need that information otherwise. It would take away from the real core of your sentence, so you put it in a positive. Here's another one. It went away slowly, comma, the feeling of disappointment that came sharply after the thrill that made his shoulders ache. What are we replacing here with this very, very long appositive? We're replacing it. What went away slowly? It was the feeling that went away slowly. Now, a word of warning here. Appositives must be directly adjacent, that is next to, the nouns they replace, otherwise it can get very confusing. So if we say, Mr. Beatty gave Mrs. Fulmer a pencil, now I want to add an appositive. Mr. Beatty gave Mrs. Fulmer a pencil, comma, the red-headed one. Now, that kind of makes it sound like the pencil is a red-headed pencil, but I don't think that that's what we mean. What we actually want to say is, Mr. Beatty gave Mrs. Fulmer, comma, the red-headed one, comma, a pencil. You have to put the red-headed one next to, adjacent to, the noun that you're replacing. And some grammar books will say that you're modifying the noun you're replacing, otherwise it's going to make it sound like another noun is being replaced. But as long as they're adjacent to the noun they replace, they can go anywhere in your sentence. You can have openers, appositives, one of 11 brothers and sisters, comma, Harriet was a moody, willful child. You can have subject-verb split put in the middle of your sentence. A man, comma, a weary old pensioner with a bald, dirty head and a stained brown corduroy waistcoat, comma, appeared at the door of a small gate lodge. Notice how we're replacing man in that one, and in the one above, we're replacing Harriet. Or you could have it at the end of your sentence. The boy looked at them, comma, big, black, ugly insects. Now, I like this sentence especially because it's unclear before we get to the appositives just exactly what them is. Here's another one. Hour after hour he stood there, comma, silent, comma, motionless, comma, a shadow carved in ebony and moonlight. Now, you might be asking yourself, how is it possible that the appositive that's underlined is not directly adjacent to the noun, which we're replacing, which would be he? But if you notice in the sentence, there is no other noun. There's no way of us confusing what a shadow carved in ebony and moonlight is referring to. It's clearly referring to he, because that's the only noun in the sentence. So, why are we studying appositives? We're not studying appositives just so we can punctuate correctly. We're not studying it so that we can pass the ACT or because we want to sound nerdy. In fact, if you don't call it an appositive all the time, you might get confused, but that's not really the issue. It's not about calling it the right thing. We are trying to compose more interesting and varied sentences in argumentation and in fictional writing. And the more that we do that, the better writers that we will be. For example, in fiction, you might say, Papa, comma, a good, quiet man, comma, spent the last hours before our parting, moving aimlessly about the yard, keeping to himself and avoiding me. And this is a great fiction sentence. It's got a small appositive. I want to push us to use appositives in argumentation, however. So we've got this sentence. Advertising has created a need for unnecessary products. We can replace a noun in here, and we're going to try and replace advertising. That is, add more information with our positive. So we could say, an amoral industry that relies on ever-increasing demand, comma, advertising has created a need for unnecessary products. So in doing so, we've given more information on what advertising is. We've actually made an argument in our appositive. One of the things we're going to do is unscramble sentences as we're starting to learn how to use appositives. This will get us kind of into a flow with where things go and what appositives look like. Now, here's my rule. You must write out the complete sentence every time. You will never learn anything if all you do is write A, C, D, B on your piece of paper. Instead, when you rewrite the sentence, your brain gets rewired to understand how these sentences work. So we're going to unscramble this, put this in the order that it goes in, and provide punctuation. Unscrambled, we would get this. She struggled as usual to maintain her calm, composed, friendly bearing, a sort of mask she wore all over her body. What is the mask? It's the bearing. It's her facial expression, which is what a bearing is. So you can see that bearing and the sort of mask are right next to each other because that's the appositive. So now, I hope that you're ready. You are going to be taking a quiz on Edmodo, just so that I can see how you've picked up on some of these ideas, and we'll start practicing in class tomorrow. Good luck.